There's no other word for this other than overwhelming. There are computer parts here of all different shapes, sizes. I mean, what the heck is this thing? What is this thing? What are these tiny little things, and what are they compared to something big and heavy and beefy like this? These are all parts of a computer. But don't worry, I know this looks really complicated and pretty overwhelming, but I'm going to teach you today what the different parts of a computer are, what they do, and to a certain degree how they work. But for the purposes of today's video, we're just going to focus on one computer, a simple tower that actually lays out everything very easily so that I can more easily teach you all of the different parts and what they do. And we're going to switch to that computer now. I chose this computer to use because it's very, very easy to show you on this computer how a computer works. Why is that? Because this is a very simple computer. Everything that I teach you in this video could be applied to a computer 10 years older than this or 10 years newer even. Not every computer that you're going to see is going to look like this. There's a ton of variety when it comes to different types of computers. But at least with this one, it's going to be similar enough to what most people have seen either at their home or in their office or at their school or at the library. And so it's very relatable. You're going to look at something of this kind of box shape and size, and this will span decades in terms of aesthetic style. So it doesn't really matter how old or new the computer is. You open up the inside and they're all going to look pretty much the same if they look something like this. I think that taking it apart is going to be the easiest way to show you what the different parts are and what they do, because as I take them out, I can say this is what this part is and this is what it does. The other reason this computer is great for teaching you about computers, the only thing that we need to take it apart is one screwdriver. Have you ever wanted a gateway so bad before? As tempting as it is to just jump in and start unscrewing things, the most logical place to start is also the most obvious: the exterior. And there's a lot to be known here. The shell of the computer is called the case, or chassis. If you're fancy, you might call it a system cabinet. This is generally made of aluminum or steel, and with some exception, it'll usually follow one of a few industry standards called form factors. These define what parts it's compatible with. Cases come in all different sizes, and so do the internal parts, so it makes sense that there would be a set of standards for the size and shape of a lot of parts to make picking out compatible parts easier. Most computers will follow some variation of a form factor called ATX. This gateway is no exception and uses a version called micro ATX. So we know it's called a case, and we know that this one is micro ATX. But what does the case do? The first thing is rather obvious. It holds all the parts. Beyond keeping them away from prying fingers and random objects invading its personal space, the case also mounts the parts securely enough to survive shocks and falls. Usually. The case may also be responsible for grounding the parts inside. It will also usually provide places for ventilation, allowing air to enter and exit the case in a logical way that gives the components enough airflow to properly cool themselves. Some cases even have filters for the intakes to make maintenance easier. Of course, the case will provide all of the exterior places for you to plug in stuff or press buttons. On the front of the case, you'll often find access to commonly used things like USB ports, SD card slots, and plugs for headphones and maybe for a microphone. At the top, we also have a power button and a light that tells us the system is on. Some cases also have a button to hard restart the computer, and maybe an activity light that blinks to indicate the computer is thinking, as it were. This is also where you'll find the optical drives for CDs, DVDs, and if your drive supports it, Blu-ray discs. With this case, like many others, the drive is hidden behind a hinged cover that moves out of the way when the drive is opened. Around back, we have the majority of ports. At the top, we have our power plug. Some cases have this near the bottom instead. There will be a row of ports that are actually on the back of the motherboard, and these will include the usual suspects: USB ports of some variety, like this mix of black 2.0 and blue 3.0 ports, a selection of audio ports for plugging in speakers, etc., an Ethernet port for connecting a wired internet connection, and for most computers you'll also find plugs for your monitor up here. These two round connections aren't relevant for modern computers, but they're called mini-DIN ports, and as the icon next to them suggests, you'd use these to plug in older styles of keyboard and mouse. If your system is equipped with a dedicated graphics card, you'll find the display outputs for it further down. If you see these, plug your monitor or TV into those, not the ones on the motherboard. Lastly, looking around the case, and we see a vent on the back for an exhaust fan, another one by the power plug to exhaust hot air from that power supply, some empty slot covers that we would remove if we wanted to add extra cards into the computer, and on the side panel we have a large mesh section to allow air to move more freely into and out of the case. We've even got a spot for a lock if you want to lock people out of your computer. Now it's time for the fun part. Having removed the two black Phillips screws holding the side panel in place, we can now slide it sideways and remove it, revealing the inside of the case. Now we can gaze at the innards, and kind of looks like a city in there, doesn't it? With all that's going on here, it's hard to pick a place to start, so let's make it simple. Computers are, at their core, just machines that work with ones and zeros, right? Well, did you ever think about how the computer knows how to read a 1 or a 0? Simple. 0 means off, 1 means on, and specifically referring to if a particular wire in the computer is on or off. Electricity. To do all the things it does, at its very heart, all these parts are cleverly manipulating the power running and all the tiny wires and circuits by turning the power on and off. Very, very fast. Literally billions of times per second in some cases. If asked what the most important part of the computer is, many people might say the processor or the motherboard. But what are all those parts without power? For that reason, the first part we're going to take out is the part that delivers that life-sustaining power to everything in the first place, the power supply unit. Often called the PSU, or just power supply for short, the job of this part is very simple but extremely important. It takes power from the wall, be it 120 volt or 240 volt, and feeds it smoothly and consistently to the rest of the parts at the correct voltage. On average, parts are going to consume power at 12 volts, but you'll also find parts that ask for 5 volts or 3.3 volts. The largest connector has 24 pins and supplies main power to the motherboard. There's a small 4-pin connector here that specifically provides power to the processor on the board. In newer systems, it's commonly 8 pins instead of 4. The other connectors will plug into the rest of your parts, such as storage drives, and larger graphics cards also require their own 6 or 8-pin power connections. The power supply can be located at the very top of the system or sometimes at the very bottom instead. The main thing you need to know about the power supply is the amount of output it has, and we measure the amount of power it can produce in wattage. The higher the wattage on the power supply, the more powerful components you can install in your system. Having powerful processors and especially powerful graphics cards demand more powerful power supplies, so a gaming computer will have a higher capacity PSU with more connectors for parts. Taking the power supply out of the system really removed a lot from it, and we can see the rest of the parts a lot clearer. But let's continue removing cables. And we're going to start with these ones right here, these black ones connecting to these two parts at the top and on the side. These two cables are called SATA cables, and they're responsible for sending data back and forth between your motherboard and whatever storage drives you have in the system. This can include hard drives, solid-state drives, and optical drives. Let's take those out next. The hard drive in this system is housed in a removable cage, and with it out, we can remove the 4 screws holding the drive in that cage. The hard drive's job is to store information, specifically those 1s and 0s we talked about earlier. If we remove the cover, which you should never do with your own, we can see the drive is made up of 2 main parts, these shiny silver discs called platters, and this little arm that's tipped with read-write heads. If you have a solid-state drive, it serves the same purpose but operates differently. Hard drives represent the 1s and 0s by changing the magnetic field of tiny sections of the drive between north and south polarity, hence having 2 states that can represent the 1 or 0. Solid-state drives use chips to store these values digitally in what is known as NAND flash, sort of like a flash drive on steroids. With no moving parts, solid-state drives are exceptionally faster and more durable than hard drives are, and because they have these tiny chips instead of big platters, they can be made in a variety of shapes, including much smaller ones about the size of a stick of gum that can slot directly into your motherboard and don't need a separate cable for power from your power supply and data from your motherboard to run. But this comes at a cost, not a huge one, but they are more expensive than hard drives per gigabyte. For now. If your system is equipped with a dedicated graphics card, it'll be located in one of these slots right here. We're not going to go into too much detail about what the different types of slots are, but all you need to know for this video is the most common one you'll find is called PCI Express. These can be long or short, but the longer it is, generally the more data it can move back and forth. The longest slots you'll commonly find are called by 16 slots, written out as 16 with an X in front of it. These are where most graphics cards will slot in. Removing this one is as simple as opening the slot cover, removing one screw, and releasing the latch on the slot. The graphics card can then be pulled straight out to remove it. Not all systems need a dedicated graphics card. If you're just doing light tasks like web browsing, productivity, or homework, email, stuff like that, then your CPU usually provides enough graphics performance on its own to handle all of those light tasks. A separate graphics card is usually only necessary for gaming, video and photo editing, computer-aided drafting, or other tasks that demand more of a computer's graphics system. But sometimes people want to add a graphics card just for the purpose of having an additional type of display output. Next up, we can unplug everything from the motherboard and start unscrewing it. We'll go over all these plugs later. Once all the screws are out, the motherboard should be free to take out as well. And there's a lot going on here. The motherboard doesn't have a ton of actual power to it. Largely speaking, with all the other components being the same, you won't notice much change in performance between different types of motherboards. That's because the motherboard's job isn't to do much of the heavy lifting. It's more of the spine of the computer where all the parts plug into. If the computer really was a city, and all the other parts like the processor and graphics card are the buildings, then the motherboard is the city's infrastructure. It's the roads and pipes and power lines that connect everything together. All of your exterior ports are either on the board itself or plug into the board at one of the many groupings of pins called headers. On the top half of the motherboard, we find the meat and potatoes of the computer, the processor and the RAM. RAM stands for Random Access Memory, and it serves a very important purpose. It holds everything that the processor is currently working on. It's the workspace of the computer, so when you load a program, it's loading into your RAM. If you're working on a document, that document is being held in RAM. When you turn on your computer, the operating system, such as Microsoft Windows or Apple's macOS, is loaded into RAM. RAM is extremely fast compared to your hard drive or even your solid-state drive, so it makes sense that your processor would want somewhere to put everything it's working on that's very quick to get to. That's why it's right next to your processor. Let's talk about that processor, or CPU, which stands for Central Processing Unit. As the brain of the computer, it's responsible for doing the majority of the heavy lifting for the tasks that you use your computer for every day. It also sucks the majority of the power that's sent to the motherboard. Because of this, it needs to be cooled, and that's the job of the cooler. Loosening the 4 screws holding it on, and we can see that it's made up of 2 main parts, the heatsink, which is the metal fins, and the fan. Where it touches the processor, we find a gray substance called thermal paste. This fills in the microscopic gaps between the processor and the heatsink, greatly improving the transfer of heat. This is very important. The cooler works by expanding the surface area of the processor and therefore giving the fan more area to blow that heat away from. Coolers come in all different shapes and sizes, even ones that use liquid to help cool the processor. Removing the processor is a step that has many explanations depending on the make and model, but in general, you'll either have a processor with pins that insert into the board, or a processor with contact pads that touch pins on the board. Removing the cover off this one, we can see it's the latter type. And my oh my, are there a lot of connections. 1,155 on this one, but you can see that processors come in a variety of sizes. And as time has passed, we keep seeing the number of connections to a processor continue to increase. These pins are how the processor receives power and how it sends and receives data from RAM and the rest of the system. It does a lot with that data, mostly centered around manipulating it with math, though that's a gross oversimplification. The processor is one of the most, if not the most, complex part of your computer. It's also one of the most complicated to manufacture. I'll be doing a dedicated video about processors in the future, as well as dedicated videos for all the other parts you saw in this video today. So make sure you're subscribed if you don't want to miss that. And with that, we've actually made it full circle back to the case. Remember all the ports on the front, all of the buttons and lights? Those all connect to the case with these cables. They plug into specific headers on the board for audio, USB, etc. The more features of your case, such as lights, fans, and other accessories, the more cables on your case you'll have to plug in. We'll also find that fan on the back, and if we pop off the front cover, we can see our optical drive and some venting to allow the system another place to draw in fresh air. We can also see the rest of the case's metal construction and all the screw mounts for the parts like the motherboard. Well, this looks a lot less chaotic than the mess of parts on my desk at the beginning of this video. But looking at all this now, you might, I hope, be able to look at some of this and actually say what it is and what it does. And that was really my goal for this video. So if I achieved it, thanks very much for watching. Leave a like down below, it really helps my channel grow. Maybe consider subscribing. I'm gonna post a lot more videos on my channel about how computers work, different reviews of certain computers, and also quirky fun videos about computers I find interesting. So thanks very much, I'm Scott. Have a good one.